So thanks to everybody for coming out in the midst of a big game. My name's John Hancock. I'm the president of the West Plains Water Coalition. And it's a privilege to be with you here tonight to talk about agriculture on the West Plains. This is about the 15th public meeting by the coalition. These events are made possible by a public participation grant from the State Department of Ecology. And we've got a lineup coming up beginning in the fall. A few events left this year. May 18th, the deputy assessor from Spokane County will be with us at the Hilton Garden Inn for a talk about real estate assessment values and what to do about that and what to say about that. And there's research going on in that office that I think you'll all want to at least hear about. May 18th at the Hilton. How many of you are here for the first time at a coalition public meeting? That looks about like 7 for the first time. And how many of you live on the West Plains? Just almost everybody. And how many of you have PFAS in the drinking water at your house? That's 20. That's what we're here to talk about, and I appreciate your presence tonight. Our West Plains culture is generally understood as Highway 2, past the base towards Seattle. Spokane Airport, the 2 casinos, and the Amazon warehouse. Formerly agricultural, mostly rural, in an economic opportunity expansion zone controlled by an urban growth plan. But farmers stick around by nature, by history, by financial investment, by profession, and by culture. Together, we've all learned a lot about West Plains PFAS over the last 3 years. People in some of the silos of some of the agencies are doing great work on our behalf. The airport investigation, the health department kitchen filters, ag products testing by the Department of Health, and the county task force are huge progress, including now the Spokane Regional Health District, I'm happy to say. But I think of 4 big obstacles that remain. Scientific ambiguity, regulatory limitations, the cost of cleanup, and the political will to commit to it. As you listen tonight, I hope you'll hear something valuable about agriculture. Your own life determines what this all means to you. You're a piece of what happens next. Thank you for what you've done and for your interest in our shared future work together. I'm not a farmer, I just live in the country, so I welcome your corrections and your observations. Spokane County defines different rural zoning types, which describe mostly past use. The growth pattern is gradually redefining highest best use towards commercial and residential growth in the south parts of the aquifer along I-90. Here's more detail. In the color tan, it's rural traditional, designed for large lot residential, ranching, farming, mining, and forestry operations. It focuses on preserving rural character, allowing for lower intensity development and accommodating rural-oriented recreation. In light green is the Rural Activity Center. Allows for small-scale, concentrated commercial and residential development designed to serve the surrounding rural community. In darker green, large tract agriculture for large-scale farming. Agricultural land is being squeezed by population and commercial growth here on the West Plains. In the 1940s, Fairchild bought far more land than it needed right away. Some of the original owners kept farming land inside the new boundary on a lease basis. The airport now operates on 6,000 acres. Its subsidiary public development authority, called S3R3, oversees approximately 9,000 acres of development land surrounding the Spokane International Airport. This area focuses on industrial, aerospace, and manufacturing development, featuring over 600 acres of shovel-ready properties. That's former agricultural land between the airport and Fairchild. S3R3 began in 2017, around the same time PFAS was discovered at the airport. What do we mean by West Plains agriculture? This is your country, you know. Wheat fields and hay operations are all around us. Here are a few other examples. My neighbor Sherry's cattle operation is one of the largest on the West Plains. It's near Hayford and Euclid Roads, north of the Northern Quest Casino. She has 80 cows plus calves at all stages and 20 Wagyu beeves, each worth at least $3,000. It's quite an operation. I visited a pile of twine as large as a Corvette. The well's 310 feet deep, and the water's just over the maximum contaminant level in Washington. The historic crops on this formerly 1,500 ranch include wheat, oats, barley, alfalfa, and timothy, and this property has been in the family for nearly 100 years. Here's another neighbor on North Old Trails Road. 40 years of gardening, animals, chickens, and self-reliance, with significant investments in garden beds and well-tended fruit trees. In the well water at this house, there's PFAS of more than 1,000 parts per trillion. And this filter system was purchased by the homeowner at their own expense. Just across the road is the Highland Quarry. Too far north to be included in the airport zone, too far east to be in the Fairchild zone. And it's near the west boundary of Riverside State Park. So there's a lot to learn left about this neighborhood. Irrigation brings PFAS-contaminated groundwater to the surface in both farm and gardening operations without regulations. And there are no PFAS food regulations for humans, animals, or pets. On my property, this is former farmland. My 10-acre sliver was a 160-acre farm. And in the background, you'll note right in the center, my friend George's PFAS filter shed provided by Fairchild. In 2021, Fairchild sent an official notification to individual farmers living within a mile of the base. It wasn't a safety courtesy, rather a congressional mandate in the Defense Authorization Act. This is just one page, our page, of the 40-page list of all the notified Defense Department PFAS neighborhoods in the country, 40 pages. And here's the quote from the requirement detail. The 2021 National Defense Authorization Act requests the Secretary of Defense provide an annual report on Defense's notifications to agricultural operations located within 1 mile downgradient of a military installation where PFAS has been detected in groundwater on the base or has been hydrologically linked to a local agriculture or drinking water source and is known or suspected to be the result of a PFAS release at a military installation. The Coalition is grateful for the ag research by the Washington Department of Health and to our 100-plus families who've joined this important fact-finding work. It's far from over. I'd like to introduce you now from the Department of Health in Washington to Barb Morrissey and Claire Nitschke.
So I'm Barb Morrissey. I'm with the Washington State Department of Health, and just to be clear, because our sister agency, the Department of Agriculture, isn't here, the lanes that we sort of stay in is they are the agriculture agency. They help farmers who are commercial growers and ranchers. But when it comes to home-raised foods, the things that we just raise are garden produce, beef that we raise for our personal consumption or informal sale to neighbors, that's considered our lane. Basically, there's nobody in that space, so that leaves it for us, basically. So the Department of Agriculture is available if there are any growers in the room and they want assistance, they can reach out to them, and we've got a fact sheet that's got the email for that. I don't consider myself agriculture, but we have been looking at home-raised livestock. Okay, so tonight I'm just going to be sharing some results from 3 rounds of testing that we've done on home-raised eggs and meats in this community and another community outside of Yakima. And this is who I am. I'm a toxicologist at the Department of Health, and what I do there is I study the health effects of PFAS, and I develop advice for people to help keep them safe. We've developed advice for drinking water and for fish. So we do issue fish advisories if the fish are too contaminated. And now I'm on this new adventure around home-raised eggs and meat. So let's just review a little bit in case everybody's not familiar about how PFAS get from, say, a release site, like a place where firefighting foam is used. You can see, well, I don't have a pointer, but up top you can see the airport, and you can see there's foam being sprayed on a fire, and then it's seeping down through the soil over time, and it gets into the groundwater, which is down below. And because PFAS do not break down in water or soil, they're going to just flow wherever that contaminated water is going. And over time, that water is leaving those release sites and it's traveling. And in this site, it's traveled maybe 3, 4, 5 miles from the base over many decades, probably. And then when a private well is pulling water out of the ground for their drinking water and other domestic uses, the PFAS comes along. And you can drink it directly in your drinking and cooking, but there's a couple of other pathways that are unique to rural properties. One of them is that if you're feeding your pigs, your chickens, or your beef with that water, it can also accumulate in their bodies and get into the milk and the meat and the eggs. You may also be watering a garden. We know that at high levels, at least in water and in soil, plants will take up PFAS. We do not really know how much uptake is happening at the levels of contamination we have in the West Plains, which are mostly in the parts per trillion, not the parts per billion. But we do intend to find that out. So that's just a couple of kind of extra pathways of exposure that people who are raising their own food can have. So in 2023, we did some work with Claire, who's our PFAS health educator. We set up some listening sessions, and we did a couple in East Sela, which is near the Yakima Training Center, and we did one here in April with John. And one, we really wanted to hear what people were concerned about. What were their top health concerns? And what we heard loud and clear was one of the very top health concerns was, we don't know if we can safely eat the food that we're raising. We need to know that so that we know whether to eat the food or not, or whether we should just not garden, or somebody needs to tell us what to do. And at that point, the data we had, the best we could advise was it might be a problem, which wasn't very actionable. So we heard things like, I'm not comfortable eating our livestock, eggs, and produce until we have some answers about whether this is safe. Other people said, I sell to my neighbors. I don't even feel, I can't keep doing that unless I know that that's a safe thing to do. And it was coming up on fall butcher season, so it was really present in people's mind. So we reached out to the the U.S. Department of Agriculture to see if they could help us analyze the samples, because it's about $550 to analyze one of these samples. And we didn't have any budget. We had zero budget to answer these health questions. But they were willing to do some technical assistance, and they said they would run about 30 samples for us. So we're like, we're on. So within about a month and a half, we were out in the field collecting meat, and eggs. We also did, some people had live cows and they wanted to know whether it was okay to butcher them at that point, or whether they should move them to another pasture and let the PFAS kind of leave the body for a while, because PFAS are not forever chemicals in chickens, pigs, and beef. They actually can excrete PFAS faster than people can. And if you can stop their exposure, they will get rid of the PFAS over time. So we did some blood blood draws, and then we estimated the amount that would be in the meat from what was in the blood. We had a lot of other partners help carry this thing out because, again, we had no budget. It was just Claire and I. So we had the West Plains Water Coalition. They helped us get the word out to people. They've also invited us back to report on results. We had the Department of Ecology. They've been a great partner all the way through, helping us, again, get people signed up for this. People that had called them and were worried about it, they've sent those names to us. So and then WSDA, the Washington State Department of Agriculture, sent their veterinarian for the project to pull the blood samples because we were not comfortable taking blood from the tail vein of a cow. That's a real thing to do. So what did we do? So we put together a project where we offered this free testing. We've done now 3 rounds. So we did December 2023. We went back in November 2024 when we got a little bit more money. And we did some retesting at people's houses that had taken action to see if that took care of the PFAS in the eggs. And then we did another round in April 2025. And then we just did a round just right now. We're on a trip that we just collected a bunch of samples. So and what people got was their results back, and then they got our advice about whether their food was safe to regularly consume. So those are the 3 things we give them: their test results, our advice, ways to lower the PFAS in their animals and food, and then we offer retesting if they do an intervention. Altogether, we've gotten 74 samples. These are the numbers. We've gotten 42 chicken eggs, batches of chicken eggs, 3 duck eggs, 10 samples of raw beef. You can see everything that we've got there. So what do we find? Eggs. We had 30 households provide us 45 batches of eggs, chicken and duck eggs, to test. And for 80% of those households, we had to advise them to limit their consumption because of how much PFAS was in the eggs. So we were surprised at how much PFAS we saw in eggs and how many people had PFAS in the eggs. We grouped our advice into sort of 4 bins. No advice, the PFAS was too low, it was so low there was no restriction, you could just regularly eat that. A slight restriction was to eat no more than 7 to 12 eggs a week on average for a person. A moderate limit was eat no more than 3 to 6 eggs a week for an adult on average. And a significant limit was eat no eggs or no more than 2 eggs per week on average. So you can see that 50% of our households got significant restrictions. So either no eggs, 1 egg, or 2 eggs per person per week. That's a pretty significant restriction. So again, we were surprised. In terms of the meat, it was a little bit better picture. We didn't see PFAS as frequently in the meat samples. We did have a few meat samples that were fairly hot, and those people had more than 200 parts per trillion in their well water, and those animals were drinking that water year-round. But we didn't see any in the meat when the levels were less than that. So we think that we've got eggs are just really, the PFAS are really accumulating in the eggs more than the meat. The other things we learned, the PFAS we saw most often was PFOS, which is what we see in fish as well. It's just a very bioaccumulative PFAS. We also saw some PFHXS, which is just like PFAS, but a little bit shorter. Those are also the 2 most common PFAS in the water in these wells. We saw that a lot of the PFAS that are in the well water are not showing up in the eggs. So not all of the PFAS in your well result are bioaccumulative in eggs. We found that PFOS is accumulating much more in the eggs than in the meat of chicken. So we had 3 or 4 flocks where we actually took meat and eggs from the same flock, and we saw quite a bit in the eggs and either nothing or just trace amounts in the meat. And then we also saw that as the water level went up, so did the levels in meat and eggs. We also determined that this exposure is on par with what people are getting from directly drinking the water when it comes to eggs. This is an important pathway of exposure, and it really needs to be looked at more broadly, and it needs to be mitigated. So eating one egg with even a slight restriction on it would deliver the same dose of PFOS to an adult as 3 days of drinking water at the MCL. So these are kind of on par. In our most contaminated batch of eggs, one egg would be the equivalent dose of more than 200 days of drinking water at the MCL. So it can be serious and a serious exposure. This is the advice that we gave people for what to do if you have PFAS in your eggs or your meat. What are the things that you can do to lower that? Because there are absolutely things you can do. So switching the animals to clean water. For chickens, we think that there might need to be moved to a different location because we think that there's a soil pathway. So the PFAS in their body is coming out in their poop. It's landing in the soil and it is staying there. And so when the chickens are scratching around and they're pecking and they're eating bugs out of that soil, they're picking that PFAS back up. So we may have to move them to a new patch. And then also choosing animal feeds without any fish ingredients. So there is a fish meal that's sometimes used in animal feed that can have PFAS. So there could be other sources of PFAS in the eggs that we're seeing. The other actions that we've been telling people is that the PFAS is mostly in the yolk. So one way to reduce your exposure is to eat more of the whites and less of the yolks. Avoid eating any of the organ meats for the animals that you butcher, especially liver and any product made from blood. And then don't use the manure from contaminated animals in your food garden. We did some retesting, I mentioned that, to see if interventions were working. So in the first house on the left here, we sampled 3 different times. The first time, the PFOS is in the blue bar. We had quite a lot of it in the eggs there. And when we went back a year later, after they'd switched the animals to clean water and moved them to a new patch, you can see it had gone way, way down. The yellow bars are PFHXS, which is another PFAS chemical. We went back in April, like 4 months later, and it didn't keep going down. So now we're kind of working with them to see what's the other ongoing source of exposure. And then that's just another example of another house that we looked at where once they switched to bottled water, the levels started to go down. Our recommendations is that this needs to be evaluated going forward at PFAS sites. It should be looked at the same time we're mitigating drinking water. We should be looking at this. We think we should probably be switching animals to clean water when there's a food safety problem and moving the poultry to new land and retesting the food to confirm food safety. Next up, we are going to get to the garden produce. So we're not quite exactly sure how much money we're going to have or if we're going to have any money. We're waiting for our state budget. But we're hoping to do this summer to get out and kind of use the same approach to test garden produce and see if it's a problem or not. So I thought we could take a few questions now, and then Claire's going to be talking about some work that she did doing a big survey of garden needs, and then we take more questions. So, yes.
Have you graphed the correlation between the amount of PFAS and then the corresponding, so it's kind of on one graph that shows that relationship?
Yes, the relationship with how much is in the water and how much is in the eggs, so we didn't have really enough meat samples to get a correlation like that. We just don't have enough data points, but 45 batches of eggs, you actually can see a correlation. It's we couldn't graph every data set because some people's hens, they sometimes drink out of a pond, and sometimes they drink from a stream, and then sometimes they drink from the well, or maybe they have been switched 3 months before we got there and they've been on bottled water. So we didn't always have a pure 100% they're reliant on the water. So, but we did take that subset and we graphed it, and we did see a correlation. The water described about 30% of the variability we were seeing. At the higher levels, it was a stronger correlation. At the lower levels, we think that there's just other things that are happening there that we're not quite sure. We saw a pretty big spread of PFAS in eggs at the low levels in water. So we don't know if it's all water or exactly what's going on there. Does that answer your question? We're doing a full report, and that will be available, and that will have all that gory science in it. Yes. Yes.
Okay. I would like to know if there's some sort of testing that can be done for the soil itself. You've irrigated years and years with water. We have no idea what the soil is.
Yes.
How can we do that? Is there some what we could add to the soil that would help it out? That type of question.
Yeah. So your question is about how do we test the soil, and then what do we do if it's got too much PFAS? We weren't able to test soil in this project because we got a special kind of funding, and it's just for food safety. But if we were doing real science, of course, we would have retested their wells and we would have tested the soil, because we do think that is probably one of the factors. I do not know if Bree would want to talk about like what you could do on the soil testing. I know that there are companies that will test soil and they'll send you a kit. I don't know how much it is. It's probably $450 a pop, my guess. And you'd have to think about how to do that. So you take a bunch of different patches, from your soil to get an average. And then mitigation, there's quite a lot going on around soil mitigation. People are looking at bioremediation where they plant hemp or a mustard crop, and those plants are pretty good at pulling PFAS out of the soil. And then you harvest them, dry them, and then you dispose of them. So you're removing PFAS from the soil. There's other approaches where they take biochar or organic matter, they put it into the soil, and that kind of binds the PFAS and makes it less available for the plant roots. So there's a couple of different strategies. I don't think we're very far along on that yet. Did that answer your question? Yeah. One more question, sure.
This has been an issue for a long time, and we have new people moving into the area, and they're wondering how long they have to be exposed to this, how much water they have to drink before they're going to start seeing some effects on their own cells.
So how long do you need to drink a PFAS contaminated water to have it build up into your system to a harmful level? Is that your question? So that's going to depend on how much is in the water. It's going to depend on that individual person and how good of an excreter they are, because there's some variability in the human population. But in general, PFAS build up kind of slowly over about a 10-year period, and then it kind of levels off. And so most of the models that like predict what your serum level will be if you drink a certain amount of water assume that you've been drinking it for about 10 years. We do have a handout that has like a serum calculator, and you can put in your water level, and it will tell you what your serum level might be after you drank that for a while. If you were drinking it for, you just stopped in to visit and you had a few glasses, or you were just here for a couple of months, it probably isn't going to move the needle very much unless it's a very high level. A high level is, well, I guess this is a relative thing. So Airway Heights water system had about 1,500 parts per trillion in the water when they discovered it, the contamination in 2017. We consider that high. We have, there's some private wells in the area that had like 4,000 to 5,000 parts per trillion. That's high. We've got some other water systems that have 10,000 parts per trillion. That's all in the very high. And so I think but if you're talking about less than 100 parts per trillion, then it's going to take longer for you to build up that level. Does that answer your question?
Are you still testing wells on the West Plains?
I'm personally not testing wells, but I think a lot of wells are still being tested, but I'm going to let Bree answer that one because I know Fairchild, they're doing a whole nother round of testing coming up of the wells that are in their study area, and I'll let Bree talk about what's going on in her study area, I guess. But why don't we wait? Can we hold that until later? Okay. Julia, we'll do one more.
There are a lot of beekeepers on the West Plains. Are you thinking about testing their honey, or I'm curious about the pollen that they collect because the flowers are uptaking the water, and then PFAS also travels with soil and dust. If there's a budget, would you consider testing honey?
Yeah, we've been contacted by a couple of beekeepers, and I've talked to our lab. We are no longer using the USDA lab. We have to now pay for the samples. And so our lab is said, well, we could test honey, but we haven't tested much of it. And we don't know exactly. We'd have to find some honey without any PFAS to spike it and what have you. And so I think we'd have to know more before we went down that road, because we have to be able to make sense of the results. I've seen some studies out of Europe that showed certain PFAS, the really short chain PFAS, were showing up in honey pretty regularly. I don't know if that was a contaminated site or not. So I think we know it's possible, but we don't have a really good method worked out yet. But it's on my list, and I've got some people who have expressed interest, so we'll do that. All right, so now I'm going to let Claire talk about her garden survey, and then we'll do some more questions.
So my name is Claire Nitchie. I'm the PFAS health educator with Barb. I found that that's a title that kind of means nothing when I share it, because people think I stand in front of classes and teach health, health science, and that's not what I do. My job is to work with Barb, take her technical information, and turn it into plain English. And it's also my job to put myself in your shoes and go, all right, well, if that's our advice, can you all actually do something with it? And does that match your lived experience? Which gets into what I did with our PFAS Garden Information Needs Survey. A little background. Why do I care what people think? Well, one, it's because I'm your civil servant. So everything that we do should be centered in what you guys are asking us for. That's how we do good, responsive public health, is that we talk to you, especially when we have limited money. We need to make sure that everything that we are doing is matching what you actually need in your lived experience. So Barb mentioned, when we did our listening sessions in April 2023 out here, and we also did another one in Isla, and we did one on Whidbey Island and one on Camino Island, and we also went up to San Juan Island, some of the sites that Barb and I work on. But one of the top 4 things we heard from all of these communities across Washington state who are also dealing with PFAS in their drinking water is, after, get me safe water, what's my blood test, how do I talk to my doctor, what about my livestock, what about my gardens? And so we're at the spot where we went, all right, let's go ahead and look at gardens, but we wanted to make sure that we knew exactly what you all wanted us to look at. So I'm also presenting on behalf of my lovely master's student intern, Marlene, who came on to join us after we ran this survey. And her job was to look through all of the responses that you gave us and tell the story to me of what did you guys say. So what is going on? Barb touched on this briefly. A little background. Why is this a little murky? We have kind of only had science around PFAS and garden produce for about 2 years. Yeah, that's kind of what I do too when I hear about that. And we've talked to a lot of other states. So we've talked to Maine, we've talked to Michigan, we've talked to Colorado, we've talked to New Hampshire, and some of these states that are a little ahead of us that are seeing some of the research and are looking at it in their communities to figure out what's going on there. We talked to researchers elsewhere in the United States that are in universities, and we actually called researchers in Europe as well to go, okay, we've got communities asking us what's going on and what can we do. And what we have learned is that While there's not quite a consensus yet on exactly what's going on with PFAS in gardening, we have enough studies that show that PFAS can move into garden produce and potentially get into the parts of that produce that we eat. It's getting a lot of attention. There's a lot of unanswered questions still going on, so we don't have quite a clear picture, but we know enough to go, okay, we want to look into this. One thing we do want to call out, a lot of these studies were done using really high concentrations of PFAS that we're looking at that aren't necessarily the levels that we're going to see in like the real world scenarios like we have here on the West Plains. So they're looking at like parts per million, parts per billion, when we're dealing with parts per trillion. So we know enough to know that it's possible, but not quite enough to be able to predict what's happening in your homes without testing. So what do we know? I just said we know something. How much PFAS chemicals get into the plants is really influenced by both soil and water. So it's not as simple as being able to look at a water test and say, all right, that's how much we can predict is going to get to your vegetables. So the soil type, the nutrients, the pH, the amount of organic matter, the water level, how much is in that water, that's going to really impact how much the plant takes up. Now, not all PFAS behave the same way in plants either. So just like if you're new to PFAS, just like my last name is Nitchie, PFAS, as you all probably know, is kind of the last name for this entire family of chemicals that all have a slightly different personality and different way of interacting with the world. So the long-chain PFAS chemicals like PFOA, PFOS, PFHXS, and PFBS, they like to stay in plant roots. We're seeing that so far. So they, if they end in an S, they tend to be sticky in the soil. That's what Barb taught me this week. The short-chain PFAS chemicals like PFBA, PFPEA, and PFHXA, they tend to get into the stems, the leaves, and the fruits. But those types of PFAS also leave our bodies pretty quickly, so we're not as concerned about them for health impacts. So relatively okay news. Now, the other thing is that not all plants behave in the same way with PFAS. So some plant types are higher risk for taking up PFAS from the soil and water. So hemp, radishes, leafy greens. We'll get into this a little bit later too. Some plant types are also lower risk for taking up PFAS. Potatoes, onions, fruits, and it's because of where the PFAS gets stuck when the plant is taking them up in the water. Let's get to why on earth did I do this survey. So when we're talking to policymakers and asking for money, one of the top questions we get asked is, what have you heard from the community? So when we're planning on how to do a program on garden testing, we wanted to make sure that we started with talking with you, understanding what's going on the ground so that we can best advocate. And so our goals were to identify the top community questions about gardening with PFAS contaminated water across the state so that we can be really effective in the way that we approach this. We wanted to know what information or guidance you all needed most about PFAS and food safety. Like we'd heard some, but we wanted to make sure that we had a crystal clear picture. We wanted to know how gardens are currently set up in the impacted areas, knowing all the different variables that could potentially impact plants. We wanted to have an idea of what you all are already doing. We wanted to know what produce you grow, have grown, or want to grow, and also who eats that produce. So who responded? We got a lot of responses. My goal here was 60, and we got 112. So we blew out of the water what my expectations were, and I really want to call out you all here on the West Plains. 70% of my responses came from you, so you all really made a difference, and you made that much of a difference in our ability to advocate for you when we go and try and get funding. So the West Plains, you all know the site up here. East Sela, which Barb just mentioned, we got about 3% of our responses from them. They're private wells, and they've got a handful of community wells. They're also impacted by suspected AFFF. We got 2 unexpected responses from Thurston County and Pierce County. Just, I think, through the grapevine, they're also dealing with PFAS in a couple water systems. We heard from Whidbey Island. That's 12% of our respondents. There's a couple public water systems and private wells around Naval Air Station Whidbey, also suspected AFFF. And then we heard from San Juan Island, the Baylor Hill community. That's 13%. They were a public water system that had some of the highest levels that we'd seen in Washington state. And we got a lot of garden questions from them, so we decided to include them too. So these were the 4 top questions that we identified from you all that we are going to be prioritizing to look at. Do PFAS get into the food we grow? Let's look at exactly what's going on. Are some crops safer to grow than others? Is there something actionable we can do? If that's maybe not the safest to grow, how can you still keep on gardening? What does this mean for my kids and my family? You know, how much would I be exposed, or could I potentially have been exposed in the past by what I was growing? And is it safe to keep gardening? Which that one's really important because we heard from so many people that this gardening is so deeply important to you all, of the like, I want to make sure that the garden produce I have is chemical free. I like to know where my food came from. This is great for my mental health and sense of well-being, and that's why it's really a priority for us to take a look at this. How are people gardening? So 91% of the people who responded are currently gardening. And I've heard from a lot of people that you've stopped gardening because of concerns, which we understand. We had about 9% of people in our survey who had not gardened in a while because of concern. So people were using raised beds in the ground, in containers. People were able to choose whatever they did. So we, have a good idea of what are people doing. What were the most common foods people are growing? So we had tomatoes, leafy greens, zucchinis, carrots, tree fruits, strawberries, cucumbers, and squash from a big lineup of things that we asked people were growing. And we wanted to call this out because we do know that there are certain plants that are higher risk for eating, one of which is leafy greens, which when we saw a lot of people are growing leafy greens, I wanted to make sure I mentioned that one appears to be a little higher risk for pulling up some of the PFAS chemicals. Protein-rich veggies like green beans and soybeans are also higher risk. Stems like celery and rhubarb, and roots like radishes, beets, and carrots. So we see a couple of those here on this list that people are growing. For lower risk, we've got bulbs like onions and garlic, potatoes, tree fruits and nuts, fruits like tomatoes, cucumbers, eggplants, melons, pumpkins, and peppers, and seeds and grains like wheat and corn. Now, this list is based off of research in other states, in other countries. It's not based off what we have here, because as I mentioned, the soil can kind of impact stuff, but we wanted to call this out just because of what people said that they were growing. So how did respondents feel about eating homegrown produce? I see a lot of responses from people, and I always expect a certain amount of concern, but seeing 86% of people say that they are concerned to extremely concerned about this was really compelling for us. This is a big issue. It's really impacting people's sense of well-being in their home and their sense of normalcy. So that was really important for us to go, okay, we really got to start working on this one next. This is still really important 3 years later. The most common worries we saw were long-term health effects, children's exposure, and which plants are highest risk to eat. And most respondents really are trying to make the safest choices with the information they have, but they need more guidance from us, which I understand. I've tried to find guidance, and it's pretty hard to find. A lot of people are so far gardening less frequently. About half of our respondents said that they've actually made some changes. 33% of those people are using filtered or alternative water. 6% of the people who have taken action are replacing their soil. And 4% have transitioned from in-ground to raised beds. But a big thing we also heard is this is really expensive and hard for people. There's a lot of barriers to doing this, so it'd be a lot easier to just know, can I garden safely? Which is, we're trying to hopefully simplify this. The other thing we found out, I want to know where you all are getting your information, because I sometimes miss stuff. No respondents have found PFAS-specific gardening advice, which I'm not glad about that, but I'm at least glad I haven't missed anything yet that we could have been giving you all. So internet searches, family, neighbors, and friends, books and seed catalogs, and Wazoo Extension, Master Gardeners. We know that if that's where people are going, that's where we'd like to get our advice out to, so you guys don't have to go to a bunch of different places to get information. And we asked for, kind of what you've told us the entire time. You'd really like some clear, easy-to-read fact sheets that are less government-y, short how-to videos, plain language explanations, information shared through trusted local programs, and practical steps taken by other communities that work. That's why I also wanted to present on what did we hear from other communities, because we hear that all the time. Are there other communities in Washington that are dealing with this? Are we alone? What else is going on? So we went out and asked everyone. There are some steps that you can take now, and Barb mentioned them. And I also want to call out, we actually have these resources. So the first QR code, I actually did an interview with Barb that was unscripted where we talked about what we know, what we don't know, and what you can do. It's been a pretty well-loved video, but we've got that on our DOH YouTube channel and on our website. The bottom one is a podcast that Barb did with PBS Spokane, which talks about PFAS and talks a lot about gardening. So steps you can take right now. So something you can do in the meantime. Add organic matter in soil like compost, peat, and biochar. The PFAS can bind to this, and they'll just stick to that instead of getting it down into the soil and then up into the roots. Scrubbing all the dirt from produce before eating, like peeling your root veggies, including potatoes. Anything that's in the dirt, you can at least get it off before you eat it. If you have livestock that drink the water with PFAS, don't use that manure for your garden. We've heard from a lot of people that, how do I know if the compost is safe to use that I'm buying somewhere else? That is a question we have noted, and we are aware of that. If you use fertilizers that don't contain fish for nitrogen, Barb just talked about that. If the fish grew up in PFAS contaminated water, that can then bring it back into your soil. And if your water levels are high, like over 200 parts per trillion, consider installing a point-of-use water filter certified for PFAS on the spigot that you use for your hose, if you are able to. We haven't actually seen a filter that actually goes on the hose spigot itself yet, but if you do have a setup where you can install a point-of-use on that, that will start to help. So as Barb mentioned, what are our next steps? So we went out for data. Now, what are we going to do as your civil servants? We, pending funding, will be back out this summer to test vegetables. We'll have probably a limited number of samples that we can do, but we're wondering, while we're here tonight, if anybody here is interested in this, would it be better for you to do August or September? So can I get any August people that would be interested to raise your hand for growing? See 1, 2, 3, okay. Anybody in September? Okay, I've seen a mix. So maybe we'll split the difference and do late August. But if you are interested in participating, email Barb. We've got her name on all of our fact sheets out there. And if you can't find her email, you can always contact Ecology too, or local health. We all work really closely together. We all talk. But just, I really want to say thank you again. I know you will get a ton of surveys. And this was so incredibly helpful for our team to make sure that we are on the right track and that we are serving you to the best that we can. While we are trying to, stretch the dollars that we have the furthest to make the most difference, because it doesn't have to be perfect for it to be effective, or for it to be useful. So, thank you.
Perfection is the enemy of getting anything done.
Yes, perfection is the antithesis of good enough, and so we try and focus on making sure it's actionable. I see Julia, and then I can take one question, and I think John is shooing me off the stage.
I know I was in the woods, so I can't generate my own biochar. Do you happen to know the source of biochar in our region?
I'm going to look at Bree, and I see Bree shaking her head, and I see Barb shaking her head, and I see Jeremy shaking his head. So I think we've got some homework to do to see if we can go home and find that out. And I think John's shooing me off the stage, so I will be around for the rest of the night, though. Thanks, John.
The Coalition's very first public meeting had to do with class action PFAS claims by your neighbors on the West Plains. Jim McCurdy was our special guest speaker. He's an attorney on the board of the Coalition. And since 2023, we hoped that something would happen with class action cases by our neighbors. But no such luck. They're still working on it. This case is one of about 23 cases filed in the Eastern District of Washington. And many of these complainants are farmers near Thorpe and Craig Roads, east of the base, not far from here, on No Name Ditch. Those neighbors had worried about PFAS in their drinking water long before PFAS. I don't like that Fairchild engineers continue to call these neighbors human receptors. 135 people joined together in a class action against the AFFF manufacturers. In this vocabulary, in this case, the class of chemicals that we now call PFAS is called PFC, or polyfluorinated chemicals. Here are the names. For instance, in plaintiff family number 127, the Shrum family owns and operates a farming business. They irrigate with water from a private well. PFCs have entered the property, including but not limited to through the accumulation of PFCs in the pipes, faucets, shower heads, and appliances, as well as through watering the lawn. I'm continuing to quote from the case. They are no longer able to farm their land because their insurance carrier will not insure the land because PFCs are present in the soil and irrigation water. The EPA has told them that the PFCs will uptake into the crops. Their seed vendor and crop distributors will not buy their crops if they contain PFCs. Their land has depreciated in value and they cannot generate revenue because of the PFC contamination. Mr. Shrum has experienced bioaccumulation of PFOS and PFOA in his blood, which carries a heightened risk of developing several health conditions, including effects on the liver and immune system, high cholesterol levels, changes in thyroid hormone, hypertension, ulcerative colitis, fertility issues, testicular cancer, and kidney cancer. In related cases nearby by some of the same people, filed against the Department of Defense in 2017 and 2018, plaintiffs suffered financial losses when they were unable to sell the crops from their family farm, which had been irrigated for decades with contaminated groundwater, and when the value of a rental home on their property was reduced due to contamination of its water well. Aided by their son and daughter-in-law, they farmed various types of wheat and hay for human consumption on their Hayden Road property. They have farmed the property since 1982, and it's an important piece of the family income now for 30 years. The well that supplies the home and vegetable garden was tested and found to be contaminated with levels of PFOS and PFOA far in excess of those declared safe by the EPA. The family has abandoned the vegetable garden due to built-up contamination of the soil and the potential for uptake of contamination into the garden produce. These cases have not been settled, and the West Plains implications continue to expand. Here's more detail on where these class action complainants live. Some are owners or operators of West Plains properties, not residents. Some drank contaminated water from Airway Heights municipal sources before 2017, when levels of more than 1,500 parts per trillion were found by the Department of Health. There also is, at the end of each of these cases, a claim on behalf of what they call the putative class, which asks the court to find that these complainants are just particular examples of harm done to our entire community. That's what I understand the putative class to mean. The biosolids portion of our conversation now is partly recorded by Marlene Feist from the city and from Brinkman from Ecology, so they're up next. In national agricultural news, there's intense and widespread trouble from farm contaminations of both water and soil caused by contaminated biosludge from municipal treatment. But the news is far less dire here than it is in states like Texas and Maine and New Hampshire and Michigan. So up next is Marlene Feist with a recorded presentation about wastewater treatment at the city of Spokane.
It just makes so much sense. I feel like we're getting to mimic nature. We have all these people living in a really dense area that are creating what would otherwise be a toxic waste product, getting it in the most usable form out to a place that is then going to produce something great like this.
It's really a soil conditioner. We've all seen pictures of dried out soil that is so hard it's cracked and it looks like it's as hard as concrete. The addition of biosolids to that really opens it up, which helps with the growth of the plants, allows the root system somewhere to go, and B, helps it to retain more moisture.
From the plant, they haul it out here, we give them a place to be able to dump it, and then they apply it, they do the soil sampling, the application of it, and then we have to till it in.
The process is wastewater enters the plant. All of the big chunks, pieces of wood, dental floss are removed. The grit is also removed, and it is fed into clarifiers where the solids settle off to the bottom. Those solids are pumped into a process where they are dewatered and then fed into the digesters behind me. There are just so many benefits for applying biosolids to farmland as opposed to landfilling it, which is the alternative.
It really helps us, I think overall grow healthier crops. So we're super happy with this canola crop that we have out here. I would encourage anybody in the public to spend the time to go, if they can, tour the facility, get their questions answered. We have a state-of-the-art facility here in Spokane.
As you know, the city of Spokane is the largest wastewater processor in the region. Our plant, located along the Spokane River in West Spokane, treats about 30 million gallons a day of wastewater. And biosolids is obviously something that comes out of this process that you learned a little bit about. So we're heavily regulated in this area, and our regulations around biosolids go back to 1987 and the adoption of the Clean Water Act, which really was the first time that we started to address the biosolids that come out of the process. By 1993, EPA had established regulations for biosolids, and Washington, just a few years later in 1998, further amended our requirements around biosolids. In 2007, the state really started to emphasize the benefits of biosolids land application and what that could mean for our area fields and farmers. So under our required permits, our National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit, or NPDES permit, we do quarterly sampling for a wide range of parameters that could be found in biosolids. Really, we're looking to make sure that our source control and pre-treatment programs are adequately addressing pollutants that could otherwise end up in biosolids, things that we don't want there. We also, under our biosolids permit, do sampling every other month. We're wanting to make sure that our permit looks at the kinds of things that would be of interest to our community. Our permit covers treatment, analysis, storage, land application, and other elements of our biosolids work. So what happens when we test? Well, samples are collected both during that pressing out of the water, during the treatment process itself, and when they're applied on land. We are looking at a number of things, such as the total dry matter of the material, the stability of its organic content, and phosphate levels. So phosphate, of course, are some of the nutrients that we're looking to add back to the soil. We also look at things like metals concentrations. What are the levels of cadmium, mercury, copper, zinc? And we want to know what those nutrient levels are. What does ammonia look like, and nitrates? And we use those results to report around our permits, those permits that we talked to you about earlier, right? So we're telling EPA and Department of Ecology what's in our biosolids and what we've applied to farmers' fields. And we also provide that information to the farmers, along with a map of where the material went and at what level. Now, just so you know that the crops that we use this on are canola and wheat. They're really those grass crops, not vegetable crops like tomatoes or other kinds of vegetables. And we're looking to optimize the soil nutrient levels so that the nutrients go to growing healthy crops, that they're not running off the farmer's field because we've added too much. So there's been 30 years of research into biosolids, and our research indicates, it's not our research actually, it's research by the industry, by the federal and state government. It indicates no environmental degradation or human health impacts from biosolids. From our perspective, we're really supporting the Spokane River with the development of biosolids. We're able to take those nutrients, instead of adding it to the river, we're able to make sure that it goes back into the soil where it's a soil amendment, but doesn't end up in the river where it can end up being harmful. So we've done a lot of work in our region about limiting phosphorus in the river to avoid things like algae blooms in Lake Spokane. So these are the kinds of things that we're seeing by having the biosolids program. We're able to hold those nutrients and keep them in the biosolids rather than providing them back into the river as we release our effluent back to the river. And what's really another really important point is that it does increase the water retention in our soil. So we see loss of topsoil in our area because of winds and the pollution and those kinds of things. So when we do add those kinds of amendments and keep the moisture in the soil, we're able to retain the quality soil that we need to grow crops. There's challenges and opportunities with biosolids, just like there is in everything. So there's a negative public perception. People are worried about odor. They're worried about what it means to have biosolids and having food grown in fields with biosolids. There's storage capacity. As our region becomes more urbanized, there is less rural area to spread this kind of material. Also, we see, fewer farmers in our region. So we also need backup storage locations as a result. We in this winter time, it's difficult because you can't spread out the material. So we have to bunker it in large piles and wait to spread it in the spring. And obviously for this group, what's probably most important is we are concerned about potential contaminants. So things like pharmaceuticals and PCBs, of course, but probably most interesting to you is PFAS. So we've been voluntarily working with the Department of Ecology. They've done a testing campaign throughout the state to look at PFAS in biosolids. And I think Ecology is here to tell you about that information. And through their work, we're hoping that we can get some advice on limits, source control, and best management practices to be able to manage this material. We also see opportunities. So if we run out of farmers' fields to put this material on, what else could be a good use? Well, we see a lot of opportunity in the forestry and timber industry where they're growing trees for a variety of products, for paper, for wood, for building materials and so forth. And this could help with their rapid growth that they try to seek with this kind of a crop. We also could use it for city greenscapes. So we've started adding more compost in general to our landscape requirements for boulevard strips and parklands and things that we develop at the city. And this could be another way to amend those soils to make them more attractive for better landscape growth. And we're looking at collaborating with EWU, WSU, Northwest Biosolids. We have collaboration and to understand more about biosolids into the future. And so, biosolids, as we said, is an interesting topic. I know it's just one of the topics you have tonight, and I hope that this was helpful in having you understand what we're doing here at the City of Spokane.
All right, it's my turn. How fun. So, disclaimer first, my area of expertise is not biosolids. I know enough to teach about it and all the processes of it, but I'm actually doing this on behalf of another Ecology member who wasn't able to travel here today. So if you do have questions that I can't answer with my knowledge base, I will be sure to send that information on to them as well. So as I mentioned, Emily Kajowski is our biosolids coordinator at Ecology. I specifically am in kind of the site management. I'm in the toxics cleanup program, which is why you see me come before you so much with Spokane International Airport, general PFAS issues, along with Fairchild. So on their behalf, what happened in 2024, Ecology actually sampled voluntarily 44 wastewater treatment facilities for their PFAS in their biosolids. Now, I know there was a question earlier about soil testing. EPA method 1633 is the method they used for this project and is also the same method used for soil testing. It cost about $500 a pop. So it's not pocket change for sure. And so the purpose of this was to get an understanding of what's occurring in our wastewater treatment facilities across the state. And we are kind of lucky as compared to other states like Maine in that we do not have a manufacturing process in our waste streams. So that's something that's actually a huge benefit to all of us. So what they found is that PFAS was pretty widespread amongst all the wastewater treatment plants. Because hopefully by now you realize that PFAS is present in a lot of different consumer products that we use in our daily lives. It's slowly being phased out, and I'll give a plug for Ecology Safer Products Initiative, which is, again, another thing that Ecology is doing to limit exposure from kind of top down. One of the things with this project that they found is that there are slight limitations in when we're looking at different materials. So the liquid samples weren't able to be measured accurately. They're seeing some interferences, and this is something that's been seen kind of all across the United States as well. So again, we still need a little bit of research to make sure that we're accurately portraying what we're finding in these biosolids. They found low levels of PFAS, and this is, again, similar to other states that don't have any manufacturing processes. The biosolids that usually get applied to land, or what we call the dewatered, have gone through two different processes, the main clarifier and the secondary digestion. That's kind of the really cool biodome that you saw in the video, tend to be a little bit more consistent. So we showed low levels of PFAS, and again, along with around the same levels we're seeing in other states as well. One thing of note is that they found that the levels of PFAS were found in both large and small facilities. This shows that industrial discharges don't have as much impact as kind of the general populace wastewater streams. They're looking for future sampling to look at all different facility types, not just kind of the major urban or industrial plants, to get kind of further information. One of the things that Ecology put into process is 70A.266. I love saying out regulations because I think you're going to remember this in the next 30 seconds. Probably not. I have to have notes so I can remember this because it's not my area. But some things that this did, January of this year, they started convening to look at sampling guidance. So again, this is part of the process that Marlene Feist talked about. How do we sample? How do we regulate? How do we get the process started? The sampling guidance is expected later this July. That will go out to all the wastewater treatment plants. They'll start requiring biosolids facilities to sample for PFAS and report that to Ecology. They'll take all of that data and then they will come up with an advisory session. From that, that's how the regulation can actually come. So once they have enough data, once they have that support, it kind of moves forward. And then Ecology is expected to finish that biosolids report by 2029. So just remember that regulation moves a little bit slower than a lot of people expect, but there are kind of multi-pronged strategies for looking at biosolids. And we are seeing decreases as we kind of take PFAS out of kind of the source community as well. So reducing it from different angles. With that, this is Emily's information. If there's any specific questions about biosolids, she would be the one to contact. And then if you do want to contact me about anything else, this goes to kind of our Eastern Region PFAS team, which is consisting of myself, Jeremy, and Erica Beresroy. So if you do have any questions about PFAS, if it's not in our wheelhouse, we also connect with our partners at DOH and Spokane Regional Health District, and we can get your answers, or get your questions answered. Sorry, it's late. Julia.
One question, are you contemplating sampling even a small number of septic, private wells and private septic systems?
I think they're focused on wastewater treatment plants at this time. There is research showing there is that pathway through septic systems, considerable ones.
You said that there were low levels of PFAS detected in the biosolids. What was that?
Low, so barely detectable. Some of the values usually had kind of an indicator. So when they go through and do their analysis, there was not enough information to accurately say where it is, so that's called a J. I'm getting too technical at the moment, but essentially it was just at our detection limits. So I should say this, and water detection is a lot more sensitive than solid detections. So oftentimes when we're talking about solids, because PFAS binds to them, we're talking in the parts per billion. When we're talking about water, because it is more sensitive, we can go down to the parts per trillion. So there are different detection limits for the different media that we evaluate. So that's something important to note. All right. I'll be back.
My layperson's interpretation of that statewide study is we shouldn't worry about it here because the PFAS is so low compared to the other states that there's far bigger fish to fry for us in the drinking water than to worry about biosolids in Spokane County. Is that okay to say that, Bree?
It was low enough, yeah.
Let's not worry about that. Let's go on to more pressing concerns at higher concentrations. Thank you. Some of the PFAS class action families live in the Reardan School District, which serves the northwest part of the West Plains. 3 high school students have been studying PFAS, and they're with us tonight to show what they've learned and how they themselves are affected. They're members of the Future Farmers of America in Reardan. 500 chapters in all 50 states. There are 500,000 young people in professional farm training and community leadership development. Just past Spokane County, Here's where we find Reardan. You've all been there. It's not far from here. Population is 688. The National Ag Issues Forum is a competitive speaking event that challenges FFA members to research, analyze, and discuss current agricultural, environmental, and natural resource issues of national or international importance. This is the capstone project for many Reardan graduates, but their work is not just academic or theoretical, it's personal, because they live here. Please welcome Cashley Brown, Paige Cushman, and Miley Benham.
When J. Robert Oppenheimer prepared for the Trinity test, the world's first atomic explosion, fire itself became an enemy to fear. The blast posed the risk of spiraling the test site out of control. To guard against this, Oppenheimer and his team needed a substance to control the flames. Their creation of fluorochemicals eventually led to the development of per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, commonly referred to as PFAS.
The aircraft carrier USS Forrestal became a floating inferno off the Gulf of Tonkin when a misfired rocket ignited a chain reaction of explosions on its flight deck. Within seconds, fuel tanks burst open and fed roaring flames that consumed planes, munitions, and men alike. This spurred the use of aqueous film-forming foam, or AFFF, to combat fires, the main component being PFAS.
At Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, firefighters regularly trained with PFAS-based firefighting foams, often becoming soaked in the chemicals during drills. Over time, some of these firefighters developed serious illnesses. One of them, 60-year-old Gilbert Smith Jr., lost his life to cancer in 2015. This was the first death in Washington that was officially linked to PFAS.
In 2017, groundwater tests revealed dangerous contamination in the wells serving Airway Heights from the Fairchild Air Force Base. Instead of treating this as an urgent public health crisis, base officials framed the discovery as part of a routine review, softening the reality that for years, residents have been exposed to PFAS.
A local resident of the West Plains, Marcy Zambrisky, who lives just a few miles from Fairchild Air Force Base, suffered devastating losses when her husband, mother, and 2 dogs all died of cancer within the span of 1 year. In 2022, Air Force officials confirmed that her household water supply was contaminated at levels exceeding safety standards for drinking. Given the well-documented connection between PFAS exposure and increased cancer risk, it is highly likely her family's death was caused by contamination from PFAS.
While PFAS drifted through the air and water, it has also found its way into the earth beneath us. Biosolids meant to feed the soil were spread across the farmland as a gift, a promise of greener harvests and healthier land. But hidden within that promise was a poison that couldn't be detected. Over time, contamination flowed quietly through the land, seeping from soil to crop, from cattle to human, winding its way into the bloodstream of the West Plains itself, until everything was touched by one name, PFAS.
The truth to all of these seemingly unrelated stories lies in much deeper water.
PFAS contamination on the West Plains.
Can Spokane County build a bridge over these troubled waters?
Nationwide, 524 airports and more than 700 military bases, like Fairchild, have used AFFF during exercises and drills. In many cases, massive amounts of the foam were sprayed, filling aircraft hangars or across runways. The foam, washed away without any containment, allowed for toxic chemicals to seep into nearby soil, groundwater, and surface water.
The West Plains Aquifer is a vital and unique water source, but its porous soils and fractured basalt make it dangerously vulnerable. This ghost in the groundwater doesn't just linger. Every time the military base washed away AFFF, those toxic chemicals flowed straight towards the taps of thousands of people. What should be safe, clean water is now at risk, and the community is left carrying the burden of pollution it did not create.
PFAS, one of the main components of AFFF, also known as forever chemicals, are made up of nearly unbreakable fluorine-carbon bonds. which allow them to linger in the West Plains aquifer and build up in the people, wildlife, and plants, with even small exposures having the ability to turn into long-term serious health risks.
While we are all in agreement that PFAS is an issue, proponents and opponents differ on how it should be addressed. While some want to build bridges to solutions, others are afraid the river's too wide to cross.
Proponents of taking action believe that PFAS has become more than an environmental issue and is a quickly growing concern within public health and local agriculture. And communities are already experiencing its devastating effects. We further argue that the West Plains needs not only to continue, but also expand their efforts to mitigate and remediate.
Opponents contend that efforts have reached their limit. Fingers are being pointed at the county, state, federal, and corporate levels, and the true culprit may be hidden in waters too deep and dark to navigate. Further complicating the issue, the chemistry surrounding PFAS is unique and simply too complex to warrant further action. Finally, financial burdens are problematic, as they rely primarily on state and federal funding.
Still, some of the nation's most important decisions have been shaped under uncertainty. In the late 1970s, when the environmental damage had become impossible to ignore, and President Richard Nixon signed an executive order that would reshape the nation's response to pollution and public health. The creation of the Environmental Protection Agency marked a turning point, a promise that the federal government would finally protect the land, the air, and the water that all Americans depended on from threats like PFAS.
From that promise emerged a wave of legislation, none more vital than the Safe Drinking Water Act. At its core was a simple truth. Safe water was not a privilege, but rather an essential human right. That right, however, would later be tested by contaminants designed to resist heat, time, and regulation.
Decades later, the cracks in those protections widened. Beneath the soil and within the groundwater of Spokane County's West Plains, an invisible and unyielding presence took hold, exposing the gap between environmental ideals and lived reality.
And for those living with that reality, the problem is far from resolved. Proponents maintain that PFAS contamination is a serious and growing problem that deserves continuing attention and action.
Across industries, companies are taking meaningful steps to reduce PFAS contamination and protect consumers. Non-stick cook pans have even begun to advertise PFOA-free labels, demonstrating that change is possible. These early successes show that progress can be made, and we should keep moving forward rather than slowing down. As Lao Tzu once said, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.
Having PFOA-free products is just the first plank in what could become a bridge towards a cleaner living and a possible solution. Chemical exposures have been overcome before, and proponents believe that with continued research, it can be done again.
Slapping a PFOA-free label on a pan is a nice start, but it comes with a high cost. Reformulation, filtration, and water testing cost billions, shifting the burden to consumers and local communities. Ultimately, this is only a small step that hardly addresses the issue. PFOA is only one of 14,000 varieties of PFAS.
Opponents suggest that the costs associated with cleanup efforts are far too high, and with the lack of federal funding, they can't get behind long-term efforts.
Despite $200 billion in U.S. investment, the response is still falling short. Craig Vollasing of Friends of Palisades described it as a small pot of money in a huge sea of need. Every dollar spent in one place is a dollar not spent somewhere else. When billions are redirected towards aggressive PFAS cleanup, that money has to come from somewhere. What happens when a rural hospital closes, school programs are cut, and fire districts can't replace aging equipment? That trade-off deserves an honest discussion.
You can't put a price on public health, Cashley. Given the devastating effects on many people's bodies, young and old, it's absolutely diabolical that we're concerned about the cost. Protecting human health should be viewed as an investment and not an expense.
While the cost of these efforts raises valid concerns, many believe that protecting public health should come first, especially when other countries are demonstrating that effective PFAS management can be achievable.
Meanwhile, across the globe, other countries aren't messing around. France has banned PFAS in consumer products, slaps fees on polluters to help fund cleanup, and will ban PFAS in all textiles by 2030. Europe even tracks its forever pollution hotspots, and Australia outlawed major PFAS chemicals in 2025. While we're still debating labels and filters, sometimes it feels like the whole world is sprinting while we're still tying our shoes.
Sure, other countries are taking action, but labels and maps alone don't make water safe. Clean and safe just aren't the same. Politicians can claim safety while 4 parts per trillion and more remain in the water. That's not protection, that's a loophole. And just as COVID exposed gaps in our healthcare system, PFAS has revealed cracks in jurisdictional responsibility between local, state, and federal agencies.
Opponents, while sympathetic, largely believe that the contamination is too widespread, and the chemistry and geology is different from anything we faced in the past.
Bree Brinkman, site manager for Department of Ecology, warns there is no feasible way to clean out the aquifer in the near future. It would take resources equivalent to our entire national budget for PFAS and many years of work and research. And Paige, we can't help that the West Plains aquifer is especially unique because of its basalt and gravel geology, which creates a permeable environment that lets PFAS spread quickly and unpredictably through the subsurface.
Actually, Cashley, that's the first thing you've gotten right all day. Thanks to recent research done by Dr. Chad Pritchard at EWU, we now know how PFAS moves through those paleo channels. Turns out, the contamination has a roadmap, and we have the directions to track it down and treat the affected wells.
That research is a big step forward, Paige. Understanding how PFAS moves helps us target the problem more effectively. To fully grasp the urgency of continued cleanup efforts, proponents take into consideration the long-term impacts on both public health and the local economy. The long-term unintended consequences reach far beyond simple water quality issues, affecting residents, crops, and livestock for generations to come.
Before we expect others to act, we need to face the damage happening right here at home. PFAS contamination levels on the West Plains are 57 times higher than the national average. If that doesn't raise alarm, what will? Contaminated water seeps into our crops and onto our tables, turning the very source of our livelihood into a threat to our health and future. And rural landowners are left in a void between acknowledgement and action.
Local producers have been forced to alter operations after PFAS was found in their water. Some can no longer sell products such as eggs or milk, as PFAS has made routine production practices unsafe and unmarketable.
While these may seem like significant concerns, some plants, such as corn, alfalfa, and certain fruit trees, have shown a natural ability to absorb and filter PFAS. Adding filtration systems to production practices can also reduce exposure through livestock. Additionally, many older generations who have lived their whole lives consuming crops and livestock raised in affected areas tend to be less alarmed.
While this may be true, there are younger generations who will face the long-term impacts of PFAS. And they see cleanup as not just a matter of comfort, but as an investment in the health and the safety of the future. And to get it straight, even older generations raise concerns for their loved ones.
Paige, the river is gonna run and we can only watch. While it's true that many younger generations may face more effects from PFAS, fear of what might happen in the future shouldn't outweigh the reality that the situation is being closely monitored and regulated. Not every issue needs drastic measures. Sometimes, patience and proper management are more effective than panic-driven action.
Opponents argue that without accountability from the county to the corporate levels, progress towards remediation is nearly impossible.
Spokane International Airport and Fairchild Air Force Base both maintain that they are using directives from the FAA and Department of Defense, but that shouldn't absolve them from responsibility. Perhaps it's time for Spokane International Airport, Spokane County, and the federal decision makers who dictated the use of a known carcinogen to step up and do what's right for the residents of the rural West Plains.
Blame won't filter PFAS out. While everyone's arguing over who's responsible, families are still drinking contaminated water. It's time for the manufacturers to stop dodging and start fixing the problem. Clean it up, protect residents, and prevent it from ever happening again.
While we are all in agreement that PFAS is an issue in Washington state, proponents and opponents differ on how it should be addressed, with opponents pushing for fewer efforts while proponents emphasize the importance of further action.
Opponents argue that efforts have peaked and shouldn't be expanded. Blame is spread across local, state, federal, and corporate levels, powering the flood of uncertainty. The chemistry surrounding PFAS spreads contamination far and wide, and to further complicate the issue, the financial burden falls on our taxpayers.
Proponents contend that PFAS has become more than an environmental issue and is a quickly escalating concern within public health and local agriculture. Spread through water and biosolids, it affects wide areas, and communities are already experiencing its consequences. For the West Plains, maintaining current effort isn't enough. That effort needs to be continued and expanded.
At the end of the day, PFAS contamination isn't a simple issue. The costs are high, the chemistry is complex, and the impacts are real. Whether through cleanup, prevention, or innovation, one thing is clear. The challenge isn't just how to fix it, but how to do so responsibly. This leads us back to ask, can Spokane County build a bridge over these troubled waters? Thank you. Are there any questions?
Can you say a little bit about your own family experience with
Yes. So my grandpa actually lives like right across from the base, and since they basically decided that they were responsible for his contamination, they gave him the option to either put a filter on his well or to get weekly water deliveries, and he chose the filter. So this is just some pictures that they put a shed up like outside of his house, and this is pictures from inside of it. As you can see, they have to go through all sorts of those filters to get to before they get to the house to even get the PFAS out of the water. And so, yeah.
Right, as of right now, I'm a little off of the West Plains map, so we don't have any direct contact with the PFAS issue. We did have some testing on our house a while back, so I'm gonna go ask my great grandma to see if we can find those results so I can look at that. I'm also getting into doing honeybees, so I've been getting into a lot of research with how it impacts them, and I found a lot of cool stuff with that. So that's also just getting involved in it is the biggest part with me, and figuring out how I can help impact my community with spreading it.
And then for me, my family lives just on the edge of the West Plains, like a couple doors down from the weather station. And so in 2024, we had our well tested in May of that year, and that was the initial sample. And then in August of 2024, we had 8.1 parts per trillion of PFOS. And so generally a pretty small amount, but we decided to take some precautions. So my family is no longer drinking our well water, and we are only drinking bottled water that we buy. And then just recently just yesterday, we had Claire and Barbara at my house to pick up some meat from one of our breeding cows and then also one of our 4-H steers from a few years back. And we're going to have their meat tested to see how much PFAS they've contracted. We're expecting, since my family has generally low levels, for their meat to come up as non-detectable, but we're still involved in the testing. And so it's been really cool to be right in that problem, even if if I don't have the super high levels and it's not super dangerous, but I mean, that's still lucky. My family's super lucky to not be super contaminated. So, do you have a question?
Now I'm wondering about alfalfa and grains that are raised on the West Plains. Are those being tested for PFAS?
So for alfalfa, they actually don't get as much PFAS contamination because they're more of like a stemmy hay. And so PFAS normally goes up into the leaves. And I don't know, you guys could probably correct me on that if I'm wrong. I don't know we don't know a ton about that yet. It's mainly the wheat that's being affected because of the biosolids, and it gets up in the wheat head, so.
I don't know if it's what you're asking, but I don't personally know of any specific tests being done on alfalfa and things like that in the West Plains specifically.
You mentioned corn. Is corn acting as a filter for PFAS, or what is the content of corn?
PFAS is also the same way, kind of like alfalfa. It doesn't contract it as, it doesn't get contaminated. I'm not exactly sure why. I'll definitely have to look into that a little bit more, but yeah, go ahead. You guys probably are more knowledgeable on that part.
On the corn, the state of Maine has done a bunch of research on uptake into hay and corn, and they find it in the leaves of the corn and in the stem of the corn, but they do not find it in the ear of the corn. So it's just a matter of, again, getting through all those compartments of the plant, and the last one is the ear of the corn. So they're finding that they can still, even people with contaminated soil can grow sweet corn.
So don't eat the stalk.
Don't feed the stalk to your animals. It has to be snapped machine right here.
Do they pull on the yolk that attracts the PFAS more than the rest of the egg?
He says it's the protein.
PFAS binds to the protein, and so I'm pretty sure, again, not a food scientist, but in the yolk it tends to have higher protein concentration.
See how it works.
Yeah, and to kind of add on to that too with meat, it's the same way. I learned this yesterday from Barb and Claire. So it likes to bond to a specific type of protein in the blood, and so it really likes to stay in there, and so obviously that's how it kind of gets into the meat and everything. So
these students compete at the state level of the FFA competition in May at WSU. I'll let you know what happens. And I also want to let you know that Gonzaga won the game tonight, 65-56. Thank you for spending your evening with us. Big thanks to all of our guest speakers tonight. It's just a story that won't quit. We'll keep telling it and stay in tune with us. Our website, westplainswater.org, has a whole lot of information. And if you'd like to get it straight in your inbox, in your email, sign up as a member. There's no obligation. There's no cost. We'll keep the story coming. So thanks very much for coming, and best wishes for your agricultural future. Thank you.